So good evening and welcome to the Royal Netherlands Institute in Rome. I'm Maria Bonaria Urban and the Director of Study in History at this institute. And it's a great pleasure to welcome you to this KNIR Research Dialogue. And a cordial welcome also to those who are connected with us remotely. For those who are here with us for the first time, I would like to say a few words on the KNIR Research Dialogue series. This series focuses on colonialism and its legacy from an interdisciplinary and transhistorical perspective. For instance, from antiquity to early modern colonization of America, but also the colonial conquest in the 19th and 20th century in Africa, and actually everything in between. Why such an interest in the history of colonialism? Because colonialism, imperialism, and its complex legacy are at the core of the KNIR research agenda. As academic staff, we have just launched a new project about classical repertoires of Roman colonization, in which we aim to explore the role of classic colonization after antiquity up until the fascist enterprise in Africa. In the previous sessions of this lecture series, we had the opportunity to reflect on quite a rich variety of topics related to the complex dynamics set in motion by colonial power, with a strong focus on research projects that, on the one hand, prove the importance of the classics in legitimizing colonial policies, and on the other hand, aim to demonstrate the key role played by indigenous knowledge in European culture, but also the agency and resilience of those who are subjected to imperial structures. In the last dialogue, for instance, we addressed the issue of the rediscovery of classical antiquity in the knowledge of Africa during the Renaissance, when classical knowledge merged with ideas and concepts brought to Europe by contemporary travelers. But we also talked about the proliferation of the medicinal use of chocolate in Mexico and how it was contexted by the Society of Jesus in the early modern period. We have also addressed, of course, the issue of Italian colonialism in Africa. For instance, Roberta Biasillo, who is with us today, offered in her dialogue an interpretation of fascist colonial rhetoric and practices in North and East Africa between 1922 and 1943 from the perspective of environmental history, demonstrating the paramount role played by the environment in shaping fascist policies and propaganda, as well as the potential of the environment to be an analytical tool to show the shortcomings of fascist enterprise. Finally, I would like to mention Luca Peretti's lecture on the networks and interaction between Italy and Algeria at the end of the 50s and early 60s, and the presence of Italian filmmakers during the war in Algeria and the anti-colonial film production of the time. These are only a few examples of the topics which we have addressed in this lecture series that started 2 years ago and is our 24th dialogue. As an institution which is keen to critically approach the Western cultural paradigm, such as the Western canon and the classics, we feel the need to address Italian colonialism by including studies and voices which focus on African sources and help to shed new light on the long-lasting legacy of colonial structures. Therefore, today we are extremely pleased that our guest speaker will address the complexity of modern colonialism in Africa from the point of view of those who experienced colonial power, but resisted its oppression and exposed the violence and injustice that are always at play in colonial structures. So I'm very pleased and honored to welcome our guest speaker, Professor Uoldelul Chelati Dirar, Associate Professor in African Studies at University of Macerata. So first of all, thank you very much for accepting our invitation. Before briefly introducing our guest, a few words about the schedule of this evening. After the presentation, we'll have plenty of time for discussion. This is a research dialogue, so we wish to encourage a vibrant discussion and invite all of you here at the KNIR, also those online, to join us with your remarks or questions. And for those following remotely, you can switch on your camera during the discussion and post your question in the chat or use the raise hand function. And now I would like to introduce Professor Chelati Dirar. Professor Chelati Dirar was born in Asmara. He studied in Italy, in Bologna first, and after completion of his doctoral studies with a thesis on African studies at University of Cagliari, he went back to Eritrea, where he taught until 2003 in the Department of History of University of Asmara. He's also served as a chair of the same department for some years. And in 2003, Professor Chelati Dirar returned to Italy and is now Associate Professor of African History in the Faculty of Political Science at University of Macerata. Historian by training, Professor Chelati Dirar has dealt mainly with the history of the Horn of Africa, particularly Eritrea, during colonial times. His research interests focus on elite formations and on the development of nationalisms in the Horn of Africa. He has published extensively on these themes, and today he will talk on his most recent work. The title of his presentation is Italian Colonialism and Classics Through the Gaze of the Colonial Subject, and now I try to say correctly, Gabriel Jesus Aylul, Anti-Colonial Writing. Thank you. The floor is yours, please.
Thank you very much. First of all, I'd like to express my gratitude for having been invited to this institute. It's a big pleasure, and I learned a lot in the first half hour that I spent here about your extremely rich range of research and activities. So I hope my presentation will adequately fit into your global activities. What I'm trying to present today is a sort of a summary of some of the issues which I've been trying to research recently, and mainly related to sources, basically. So it's about voices of former, what used to be called colonial subjects, who somehow managed to raise their voice, to leave written evidence of their colonial experience, and therefore they offer us a more or less unique opportunity to listen alternative voices on Italian colonialism, which is normally kind of suffocated by the predominance of colonial sources, being that administrative authors or administrators or missionaries or intellectuals also. So I'm trying to see with you today how much the issue of classics has played a role in the training of those intellectuals, and particularly of this author, Gabriel Jesus Aylul, who has written a very interesting and fascinating novel on the Libyan campaign launched by Italy in 1911. So before starting that, you will forgive me for this, but I never take for granted the knowledge that people have of Italian colonialism and of the basics. So those who are familiar, I beg your pardon. And for the other, I hope they will get a better framework where my presentation will fit. So we are talking about, specifically in this case, of an Eritrean author, so an author which hails from the first Italian colony in Africa, and colonial experience, as you know, started in 1869, which is interesting because very rarely there is, I found at least, research or debate on the date. The date is very important because it's the years when the Red Sea became suddenly a very strategic sea lane because of the opening of the Suez Canal. And Eritrea somehow is very important, not because of its economic relevance or whatever, but because it was a sort of laboratory where the main framework of Italian colonial strategy were studied, were experienced, and then applied and exported to to Somalia, to a certain extent, though it was a different case, to Libya, and more important, after 1935 in Ethiopia. Another important detail, Italian colonialism has this special feature of being a colonialism with a high presence of labor, white labor, which is a very important aspect because somehow it shaped the way Italian colonialism was organized. It was a colonialism which put a lot of emphasis on the role of Italians in the colony, on the physical presence of settlers. And we will see in a few minutes how also this issue of being what some scholars define as settler colonialism shaped also the use of classics, because in this context, classics in the Italian case, of course, were very important, were relevant, because the most obvious link was with Rome. So Italian colonialism, particularly after the coming to power of Mussolini, Italian colonialism as a sort of natural development, extension of Roman expansionism. The other aspect which I'd like to bring to your attention is also the fact that after the invasion and occupation, partial occupation of Ethiopia in 1935, Italy brought together its colonial territories in the Horn of Africa, Eritrea, Ethiopia, and Somalia into a very ambitious project which was called the Impero dell'Africa Orientale Italiana. And the idea was that, in the expectation of fascism, of course, was that this empire had to last for centuries, and it was going to become just an overseas province, an overseas region of Italy. As I said at the beginning, in the Italian initial move toward colonial expansion, one of the dominant reasons was the need to find a sort of a solution to the huge problem of unemployment and migration, which affected Italy immediately after its unification in 1861, and which lasted basically all the way to World War II. So in this context, colonialism had a very specific role, was expected to have a very specific role. I move very quickly to the second cornerstone of my presentation, which is education. We are talking about intellectuals, we are talking about elites. So education is necessarily a key concept. A very interesting feature of Italian colonialism is that it consistently tried to avoid the development of a local elite, which means that education was accessible only up to grade 4. The idea was there was no need to further education for the local population, because what Italy needed was cheap labor with enough knowledge of Italian language to communicate with their colonial masters, but no need for elites, which means there was no possibility for colonial subjects in Italian colonies to have access to higher education, differently from what you can see, for instance, in the French colonies, or to a certain extent, of course, also in the British colonies. So this consistent denial of the access to education is very important, because one can stop to the legal aspect, to the formal aspect, the denial. But that would be very limiting, because at least as a historian, what really interests me is not what the colonial master did, but how the colonial subject reacted. So the issue of agency come into the stage. And that is where actually my discussion of Abba Ghebreyesus' work will mainly focus how the writing of this intellectual is a very vivid expression of agency. A quick note on classics and colonialism in the Italian colonies. As I said earlier, of course, the prestigious classic tradition of Italy, the Roman tradition, played a major role in the colonial project because of two reasons. On one side, the Roman experience was often mentioned as a kind of source of legitimacy for the colonial claim of Italy, and this is very much what we notice in the latest period, the fascist one, but already looking at the so-called liberal period, so the one which goes from the early stage of Italian colonies all the way to the 20s, and looking, for instance, and you have here a copy, I mean, the cover of a textbook for a student in the missionary schools, Eritrean students, the missionary schools. The textbook were always mentioning the greatness of Rome as a way to, how can I say, to include, to raise respect, but also to intimidate to a certain extent the young Eritrean pupil, to show how impressive was the Italian tradition and how superior was. So how impossible was to compare the local tradition with the greatness of ancient Rome. Of course, this reading of the classics was always very selective, so you never find in those textbook mention of the interaction, the fact that even Roman Empire or the previous Greek civilization had very rich and fruitful interaction with African polities. And this is particularly true in the region where you have ancient civilization going back to the 3rd century, which had a very rich and very intense economic and cultural exchange with Rome and with ancient Greece. And this is interesting because also intellectuals, very prestigious scholars, and also in this case administrators, as Carlo Conti Rossini, which are still very respected and very used. Even I'm one who use a lot those authors as very precious sources. Still, the intellectuals such as Carlo Conti Rossini, when faced with this contradiction of having a very prestigious and ancient local civilization, try to downplay the relevance of this civilization, but just saying, yeah, we have this civilization, but it's a result of external influence. So it's not a product of a local society, it is the result of an external influence, possibly from the Middle East. So this as a way of introduction, but of course, during the question and answer session, we will have time to delve deeply into this topic. But just to give you an idea of how I looked at the issue of classics in the Italian colonial project. Now, before moving into the discussion of the writing of Abba Ghebreyesus Hailu, a few epistemological issues which I think are important to be addressed because they shaped the way I developed my research. First of all, I think we always take for granted the idea of classics, assuming that classics are the Greek, the Roman, ancient tradition. Now, in the light of what I'm going to discuss today, I think we should broaden our understanding, our idea of classics, and taking into account also local classics. So in the case of Abba Ghebreyesus Hailu, it was not only dealing with the usual understanding of classics of the Greek and Roman tradition, but he was also and primarily dealing with his own classics. So the classics of his tradition, what you can broadly define as Ethiopian classics. So a tradition which has a language, which is an ancient language, which somehow played a role similar to Latin in Western tradition, a language which goes back to the 2nd century AD. And so classics by itself is a problematic notion. I think we should try to enlarge it. And of course, we can move it to other contexts, the great Arab tradition or Indian tradition or Chinese. They're all classics in my understanding, the use I'm making of the term of the classics in my presentation. Another important concept which emerged frequently when talking about African intellectuals during colonial time is the issue of modernity, or in other contexts, modernization. It is a very frequent concept, very much debated. There is a whole literature on post-colonial understanding of modernity, post-modernity. But I think, for me at least, the most controversial point is that normally this debate on modernism or modernity in the colonial context take for granted somehow what I define as sort of stifling dichotomy. The idea that you have modernizers and you have traditionalists. Modernizers are those who somehow have been imbued, have been in contact with the Western tradition, so they are the one buying the modernizing project. Traditionally are those who somehow are rejecting it and trying to maintain an alleged, I don't know, tradition. Again, I think this is misleading because it's it is based on a very dichotomic understanding of history and of human relation. And also tend to give us an idea of the world as if all those people lived in separate bubbles or separate boxes, excluding the idea of interaction, of exchange, and of mutual influence. So there is very much, again, a kind of survival of Eurocentric approach, which somehow brings back this idea of authenticity. But also on the African side, you have a lot of African intellectuals who play the same game of authenticity as if we have something which is authentic as opposed to something which is not authentic. Okay. Another topic which emerged from the novel, and maybe we will discuss it if we will have time, is the issue of mimicry. Mimicry is a very debated concept in colonialism. There are authors who suggest that mimicry is a form of resistance. So apparently you conform yourself to the colonial canon, but actually by taking it for you, claiming it for you, you are actually challenging it. I'm not so sure about it, but it is still a very important concept. But you cannot talk about mimicry if you don't take into account the issue of agency. So how colonial subjects develop different strategies, not necessarily similar strategies, in order to negotiate their own space, their own living space within the colonial environment. Very quickly to conclude, something which emerged from this author, but also from other authors of those years, there is a theme of mobility. How much territorial mobility, which is often also a way of bringing social mobility, were crucial factor in raising different perception of identity, in strengthening this notion of agency, and how much exposure to external culture had played a very important role in this process. And just to conclude, two important concepts which have shaped my research are, on one side, the relevance of something which is, for a long time, has been considered as outdated, kind of, old-fashioned biographies, the old tradition of biographic studies, because through biographies, you, at least I found out that you can really uncover networks, how people connected or were connected, how they exchanged ideas, how they developed a common project, how they shared experience, which then influence their activities and their role in their societies. So biographical studies are, I think, utterly important when dealing with this kind of issues. And the other important aspect which has influenced my work on this author is the issue of audiences. We cannot work on an author if you don't take into account for whom he was writing, what was his target, what was his audience, how this audience was built, how came into existence. Because also this is the result of a social historical process. So those are some themes which will emerge through my presentation, I hope, in a clear way. If it is too confused, you will tell me and we can try to make it clear. Quick biographical notes on Ghebreyesus Hailou. His name is always preceded by Abba. Abba is a title, means father, because he was a religious man. He was a Catholic priest. That's why he is always mentioned as Abba Ghebreyesus Hailou, and I mention him this way. So he was an Eritrean from southern Eritrea, born in 1906, who went through the first through the traditional classic education. So he learned the Bible in Ge'ez, so the ancient language of Eritrea and Ethiopia. And then he moved to missionary schools. He was a very clever, brilliant school. So after his early studies in the Catholic seminary in Eritrea, he was sent to Rome, where he did all the religious itinerary, and he earned his doctorate in theology in Rome with a thesis written in Latin on the topic De Maria Corredemptrice Iuxta Documenta Ethiopica, which was a kind of theological but also philological research on an ancient Ge'ez document dealing with the topic of Mariology, which I spare you because it's a very technical, very specific theological issue, but which in those years had a very hot, was the object of a very hot debate, of course, within the Catholic theological world. He was a very refined intellectual and polyglot. He was fluent in Ge'ez, the ancient language, as I said, but also in Amharic and Tigrinya. He had some knowledge of another Eritrean language, Tigray, and he was fluent in Italian, French, and English, and of course, as I said earlier on, Latin. So I insist on this because I want to make clear that he had this deep connection with his own classic tradition, but also with the Western classic. As I said, biographies are important because they make us understand networks and connection. So his life, in his life, two special encounters played a major role. One was with Bishop Kidane Mariam Kassa, who was the first Catholic bishop. Somebody says the first African Catholic bishop is controversial because I don't think it's correct, but the first Catholic bishop of the region. And the other one was Abba Tekle Mariam Semharai, another priest. The first one is important because Kidane Mariam Kassa, as I said, has been the first Catholic bishop in the Horn of Africa, appointed by Pius XI on July 1930. And he was very much involved into an intense theological debate going on those years on the liturgies, the Catholic liturgy. Again, I understand it might sound very boring, but in those years had a very special significance, not just from the theological point of view, but also politically. Because you have on one side let's say, the traditional hierarchy of the Catholic Church, which insisted for the Latin liturgy, so for the Latinization of liturgy, also in African, Asian churches. And then you have local religious authorities, often also intellectuals, such as Bishop Kidani Kassa, who refused it and said, we have already our own classics. We have already our own tradition. Why should we dismiss it and take something which is completely foreign, not to us because we are familiar with it, but it's foreign, it's something strange for our believers, for our local churches. So he played a very important role in this debate, and he also had he served for quite a long time in the Ethiopian college here in Rome, known as a Collegio Etiopico, which is a very old institution which goes back to the 15th century. And biographies and also institutions are also important, because this Collegio Etiopico, which still exists in Rome, was established initially just as a hostel for pilgrims, religious people, but also not only for religious authorities coming from, broadly speaking, Ethiopia, which would be nowadays Ethiopia or Eritrea. And then it became, through centuries, a very important cultural center where those special guests shaped the European understanding of Ethiopian culture, Ethiopian traditions. The first printed version of the Bible were produced in this Collegio Etiopico, but also they were somehow shaped by the Italian classics, by the Western classics, by the European tradition. So this is where Abba Gebreyesus Hailu met Kidani Mariam Kassa. The other important encounter, as I said, was this Abba Tekle Mariam Semharai, a much more radical intellectual, again a priest, again a polyglot, so again, as I said, Ge'ez, Amharic, Tigrinya, but also Arabic, French, English, Latin, and in this case, a much less diplomatic intellectual. So Kidani Mariam Kassa was a bishop, so was from the establishment. He had to be much more, diplomatic in his strategy, in his handling of his role in the church. Kidani Mariam, Abba Tekle Mariam Samharai was a very refined intellectual, but also very radical. So there is a collection of paper of correspondence here in the Vatican archives where he openly challenged the Catholic authorities in Rome, in this Collegio Etiopico, by accusing them of discrimination, of utter ignorance of the wealth of tradition which they had, so the Ethiopian ancient tradition, but also he tried to bypass its authorities, trying to get in contact with the Pope, so bringing his case to the Pope, which actually answered in quite sympathetic way. So it's also a very interesting example of how agency worked. So those two people, again, were very important because Abba Gebreyesus Hailu met them during his studies here in Rome. And you can notice, if you have the time and the patience to read his novel, how much this radical feeling and also this strong awareness of the wealth of tradition which he carries with him is something which cannot be negotiated, cannot be dismissed just because of respect towards the religious authorities and the Catholic tradition. Therefore, he was a priest, he was a religious authority, but he was also a militant. So he finished his doctoral studies, his theological studies here in Rome. He went back to Eritrea, And a few years after he was back to Eritrea, the Italian colonial administration collapsed. So the Vatican transferred his bishop, Kidani Mariam Kassa, to Addis Ababa, and he went to him with him. And the mission was to somehow take over the Catholic Church in Ethiopia, which of course was in very dire situation because the Italian priest had run away because of the collapse of the colonial system. So they were put in charge of restructuring, reorganizing the church. Then he served in different positions within the Ethiopian government. He was a cultural attaché of the Ethiopian embassy here in Rome for a couple of years. Then he went back to Ethiopia. He was appointed as in the Ministry of Information. Then he worked into the he was appointed in the National Library and in the National Academy of Language. So a religious man, but also an activist, we would say nowadays. And this is something which I think is very much rooted on the early experience which he had with the intellectuals which I mentioned earlier. Now, quickly, let's go through the text. This is the cover of the first edition. I've translated it as Lascaro, but it is not the title. The title in Tigrinya is much more clumsy, is a story which narrates of a young who ran away from his family to go back to Libya to fight. And the publisher says, we are not going to use this title because we will never sell a single copy. So I had to bow and accept his suggestion, which was, I would say, very smart. So in few sentences, the novel is about a young Tukwabo who decide to run away from his family to join the Italian colonial army and go and fight in Libya. So we are talking about the Libyan campaign launched in 1911, which after 1912 saw a growing involvement of colonial troops, mainly from Eritrea, but also from Somalia and Ethiopia, which lasted all the way to the late 20s. Very quickly, this is important. It is not a conscript. It is a person who, you know, youth and masculinity and all kinds of different economic perspectives in a colonial environment which did not provide good job opportunities for local youth, decide to join the army. So it is a relatively free choice. It's difficult to define what is a free choice, of course, in this context, but it was not taken by force. He made a decision. Actually, he abandoned a relative wealth family, okay, rural family. This is the first chapter of the book. The second chapter is about the experience of traveling. So you can look at it as a novel which fit into a common tradition in literature, okay? What is romanzo di formazione in the Italian definition of it, no? So the second chapter is about the experience of traveling through the sea, which is, I think, is the best part of the whole novel. It's so intense in narrative terms, it's so poetic, but it's also the idea of discovering the unknown. He's a young boy coming from the highlands, so about 2,000, 2,300 meters above sea level, which is where he comes from. And all of a sudden he finds himself in the sea, and it's something completely new. So there is a whole chapter devoted to this experience of traveling through the sea, discovering new worlds, new cultures, the Sudanese, the Egyptians, the perception of difference, but also of local racism. So the idea he looks at it, but those people are so black, and he is black himself, but you know, those are nuances which are within the African society. So there are tension and dynamics which, as an African author, he brings to the fore quite, I would say, candidly to a certain extent. Then the other two chapters are about the war. Okay, so the war, first of all, the contact with the desert, the first shock. He comes from the highlands, and all of a sudden he finds himself in hell, in an environment which he doesn't understand. There is no water, there is no Greenland, there are no trees, and it's always hot, and you cannot just survive, and you have to fight, and you have to march, and you have to fight, and you have to march. So the desert and the real fighting. And the real fighting is probably the most horrific part of, because he's mainly trying to show how merciless are the colonial officers, how they use this labor, if you want, this military labor with no humanity, with no attention, with no care. And there is a sentence where he said, towards the end of the book, he said, they are, for the Italians, those askari are like an old donkey whom is too old. You cannot eat the meat, you cannot use the hide because he's too old. So you just abandon him in the desert. So it is a very scarce, very strong critique of Italian colonialism. So it's a strong voice, which is, as I said, unique, because if you read the contemporary Italian sources on the war and on the askari, it is exactly the opposite. It is the idea of course, they are inferior, but we love them. They are like our children. We are like their father. It's a big family. They will do everything for us. They will die for us. There is mutual and endless love. Okay, and he gives a completely different reading, a completely different perception, which by itself, it makes it a quite interesting source. Now, as I said, it is important to understand the context, and it is important to look at the audiences. One, if you want, methodological issue which you cannot avoid is, if you have such a restrictive, such a limiting educational policy under Italian colonialism, which doesn't allow the access to education beyond grade 4th, how do you have an audience which can receive such a message, who can read this book, which is also a book very rich of quotation, biblical quotation, Greek quotation, Latin quotation? How can you have an audience for this book? But if he wrote this book, he had an audience. So this brings the issue of how this audience was built, how it was created. Of course, it was not created by himself. There is a tradition. And just to mention, there are a long list of intellectuals which wrote in those years, but I mention here some of them, like Fısaha Gürgis and Sengal Workneh. Fısaha Gürgis, he was again an intellectual born in the mid-19th century with the same background, very strong classical background in Ge'ez, so he knows perfectly the Bible in Ge'ez. And then he moved to Italy, where he learned Latin, he learned, of course, Italian, French. He lectured, that's a very important aspect, he lectured Ethiopian classics, so Ge'ez, Amharic, in the Istituto Orientale in Naples. So this connection also, I said institutions are very important. I mentioned earlier on the Collegio Etiopico. Istituto Orientale has been a very important cradle of this network of intellectuals. I don't know if you are all familiar with the institution, but basically the institution was, it started as kind of center of Orientalism before the colonial expansion, but then under the colonial expansion, it became a privileged place for the training of colonial administrators. So the teaching of Amharic, Ge'ez, Tigrinya, it was not just for the sake of culture or education, but it was also to provide tools to the colonial administrators. So Fısa Gürgis taught in this institution, but he also wrote this title. As you see, Eritrean intellectual didn't have a gift for very appealing and short titles. In this case, it's a very long title. It is about the travel of an Ethiopian from Ethiopia to Italy, written in real Tigrinya language, spoken in Aksum, the capital of Ethiopia, and in Adwa, capital of Tigray. So it's not very editorially impressive title, but nevertheless is about his travel experience. So he explained how he travels from Eritrea to Italy, how he experienced the sea, the technologies, the Western society, and also the stereotypes. So one of the first things that he says, well, I landed in Napoli. By the way, if you go to Naples, be careful, they are all thieves and you have to take care of your pockets. Okay, so it is a very interesting document. So you have this familiarity with this idea of writing about the contact with the West. You have another intellectual, Afewerki Gebreyesus, again, an intellectual trained from a very important Ethiopian family, again trained in the Ethiopian classics, then moved to Italy. He studied in Turin, and he wrote what is considered the first modern Amharic novel, Lib Waled, which Tarikh, which means a story born from the heart. And it's interesting because in contemporary Amharic, Lib Waled is a term used to say novel. Okay, just to tell you how important it has been. And again, he lectured from 1902 to 1912 Amharic at the same Istituto Orientale in Naples. Final intellectual Senghal work again from Ethiopia, from Tigray, again religious training, but he then went for this military career. He became an officer, went back for a short time to Eritrea as a interpreter in the colonial administration, which was the maximum, the top occupation which a colonial subject could achieve. No further career opportunities were offered. So he moved back to Naples, where he again taught Tigrinya, Amharic, as the Istituto Universitario Orientale, and he wrote this poem with this very long title, How, Because of Two Wild Beasts, the World Was Set Alight. We are during World War I, so he wanted to share with his compatriot what is the war, the experience of the war. He is very sympathetic with the Italian. He also fought very hardly to get the Italian citizenship. He was rejected 3 times, but eventually he succeeded, and he was very proud of his Italian citizenship. Therefore, he wanted to show to his compatriots how the war was going on and how cruel were the enemy of Italy, so the German and the Austrian. But unfortunately, his novel was prohibited by the censorship because so he wrote it with very sympathetic intention. The idea that colonial subject could know about military defeat from the prestigious colonial force was unacceptable. Therefore, the text did not circulate in Eritrea. So just to say that you have an audience which was built by the time this book was published. An important detail, he claims, the author, Abba Gebreyesus, claimed having written the book in 1927, but not having been able to publish it before 1950. He says because of lack of money. I suggest also because of censorship. I guess it was not realistic, the idea of publishing it before. So when this book was published, the audience was there. It has been created through this complex process, which I tried to explain earlier on. We can skip this. Now, why the biography is important? Because through the biography, you understand also how this text came into existence. his biography is an expression of how this generation tried hard to circumvent all the obstacles, all the limitations of the colonial administration toward, with regard to the access to education, and managed to become full-fledged intellectuals, cosmopolitan intellectuals. So therefore, they managed to, in this case, the shortcut was the religious career. So the religious institution was the privileged road to education, because it was the only one which was somehow accessible and which made to colonial subjects and made them possible to travel and to be trained either in the Catholic institution or the Protestant institution, but also the Islamic one, because we have also an important component of the population which was and is Muslim, and of course they were following different channels, but still religion was the escape from the colonial repressive educational policy. Going to the specific issue of the classics, what from my point of view, make Abba Gebreyesus Hailu writing really fascinating is the fact that there is something which I would define subversive in his writing. You find a lot of intellectuals which somehow get a sort of fascination with Western classics, but a fascination which is also an expression sometimes of a cultural subalternity. Okay, I'm very brutal in this, but I mention always a very respectful, a very important intellectual such as Senghor. Okay, Senghor was an incredibly rich, incredibly gifted intellectual, but I've always been impressed by one of his statements where he said, for me, French is the language of rationality, and Wolof is the language of emotion. And for me, this is terrible. He said it as a way of celebrating, of course, the Wolof culture by saying it's a rich culture, it's not, you know, encaged into rationality, whatever. But for me, it's terrible because it's like saying in your culture, in your language, you cannot express something which is linked to rationality. And for me, it's a form of subalternity. At least it's the way I read it. And you can, of course, challenge my reading. Now, what I found fascinating about Gebreyesus Hailu is that there is never comparison. He shifts continuously. He used popular culture, proverbs, women's songs, children's songs, and then he brings back the ancient tradition of the Bible, quotation from the Ethiopian version of the Bible, or he mentioned Leopardi, or he mentions some Greek philosopher or whatever. So it is like swimming in a very relaxed way in different seas without being intimidated by any. Okay, so this is what I define as a balanced and very mature relation with classics. And not only, he used those different cultural world, cultural universe, because it is also functional to his project as an author, as an intellectual. To make clearer what I'm trying to say is, when he quotes from the Bible, the Greek Bible, he knows that for his audience, the message is direct, is immediate. They know what he's talking about. Okay, so it is, he's establishing a channel by using its own classic tradition. Because they share what I put here as a common semantic and semiotic heritage. Okay, so they speak the same language, not just linguistically, culturally. Okay, but when he quotes from the Western classic tradition, so Greek tradition, Latin tradition, what he's trying to do is to share with his readers something which they don't necessarily all know. So there is a kind of pedagogical mission in his writing. And this is something which you find also in some of the authors which I mentioned earlier on. They try to explain, for instance, to their colleagues, to their compatriots, aspects of Western modernity. So how the modern ships work. So the mechanical aspect, or the warfare, the new weapons. There is in the poem which I mentioned earlier a section which he put a footnote and says they call them what is British for the English for it? Siluri, torpedo. I think is Siluri. Torpedo. So they call them siluri. Siluri are kind of long metallic fish which go swimming and can destroy and blow up a boat. Okay, so there is constantly this attitude which I define as a sort of pedagogical attitude. Then, in this context, both Western and local classical tradition, but also popular culture, because he doesn't limit himself to the local classical tradition. He borrowed from songs, from proverbs, from popular hearsay, and so on and so forth. Because for him, it is a kind of huge container of meaning, which he used with sort of, I define as a sort of serene equidistance, okay? So he doesn't establish any hierarchy, any relation of subalternity. This dimension of this narrative dimension in the textbook, so this idea of this, what I called earlier on as the Romanzo di Formazione or Bildungsroman, is something which belongs to a literary genre, literary canon, if you prefer, but there is also a subversion, because in the Western traditions, literature traveling, dealing with travels, with travel experience, particularly the one produced between the 18th and the 19th century, was part and parcel of the imperial process, okay? So to travel was not just to discover, but was a way to map the so-called unknown world and then to provide tools to the imperial expansion. In the pages of this novel, the experience of traveling and writing about this experience is something different. So it is a subversion of this literary canon, because it is a cognitive experience, which is also a subversive experience, because it shows how the subaltern see the experience of traveling by train from Asmara to the sea, the experience of traveling from Massawa to Egypt by boat, the experience of the Western technology, but also the experience of the way the Western society works, and how the external world, the world outside Eritrea, is organized. So it is a very strong critique, I say the scattered critique of Italian colonialism, so a unique literary experience, voice on Italian colonialism, but it's not only that. He's also voicing a very strong critique of his own society. So what he says is, you see the Arabs, you see the Libyans, they are real people, they are real men. Why? Because they fight, they resist. They don't have a centralized government, they don't have a very disciplined army, but they do all they can do in order to resist to the colonial oppression. And you, what do? Not only you have accepted them when they came to Eritrea, and he used this expression, which is a very nice expression, because it's an expression from the cultural, from the popular culture, because it says, you receive them as you do with children when they start, they are tottering, they are not able to walk. So what do? You take them away, smiling and singing, and you show them the places. You did the same. You took them from Massawa, you accepted them all the way to the highland, and then they colonized you, and you did not react. You didn't stop to that. You even went further, and you played their own game by helping them to subjugate other people. So it is a very strong critique also of its own people, and there is a critique of what I said earlier on, mimicry. So when he describes the return of the Ascari from including Tukwabo from Libya, and they arrive at the station, the family are all, waiting. They don't know if they're coming, when they're coming. So they keep, asking to the administrator in the railway station who are Eritreans. So when are they coming? And he uses this sentence. Those people who spend all their time saying Brunto. Brunto is a kind of Eritreanization of pronto. Sorry, that tells me that I finished my time, but I don't know how to stop it. Okay. So spend all the time saying Brunto. So just because of this, they think to be more civilized as their own people. And when their brothers and sisters go there and ask for information, they just, disregard them. They dismiss them with kind of despise. No? So it is a critique also of mimicry. Those people who just, because they have a small position in the colonial system, they think to be something better than their own brothers and sisters. So, as I said, it is an anti-colonial novel, as also the publisher wanted to write in the title. It was not my idea, but he said, no, it has to write anti-colonial novel because you can sell better. But it is anti-colonial in a broader sense, not just against the Italian colonizers, but also the way this system penetrated into the flesh, the souls of the colonial subject, and then went into their own relation and somehow corrupted them. So I think I can stop here, conclude by saying that this novel, at least in my understanding of it, can leave us with 3-4 main understanding. The first one is that we have to look, that is my understanding, you have to look at the colonial environment as a very complex system, full of nuances. You cannot just reduce to, the dialectics of colonized and colonizers. Is something much more complex, full of nuances, of fragmentation, and also contradiction. These call for more scrutiny of what is the subaltern agency and how it has been able to position itself within this fragmented landscape. Just to give you an example, Abba Gabriel Jesus Hailou, I said, is an example of very strong and conscious anti-colonial attitude. The other intellectuals, which I mentioned earlier on, Afewerki Ghebreyesus was another very rich, very impressive intellectuals who bought completely the Italian narrative. So when the Italian invaded Ethiopia, actually he said, well, that is maybe good because it could be a shortcut for us toward modernity. Because if you try this road on our own, we'll not be able to succeed. Under the Italian, we'd be more successful. Okay, so two intellectuals from the same area, more or less, with a very similar background, completely different understanding of the same process. Okay, so the need to look at the as a complexity, and again, as I said, we should refrain, and I know it sounds obvious, but if you look at the literature, it's not so obvious. We should refrain from reading the colonial society in terms of need separation, the colonizers and colonizers as if they lived in separate blocks, in separate bubbles. It was a much more complex and interrelated and interdependent environment. And of course, from this point of view, I just quote what Appia says, when warned us about the fact that cultural purity is an oxymoron. Because if there is culture, there is no purity. There is always contamination. There is always exchange. And I think I stop here.
Thank you very much, Professor Chelati Dirar. It was very rich and fascinating presentation. I think we have all learned a lot from your sources and from your analysis. And I'm sure there are a lot of questions. So I invite the people here in the room, but also the people online. If you wish to ask a question, please let me know, and we will start an open discussion. So someone would like to start? Yes, I see many hands in the room. So Claudia, Beatrice, and then...
So thank you very much for this amazing presentation. I like this first question, actually, like I was reflecting about what you were saying initially, okay, about like the role that the audience has in the construction also of the text itself. And it was like really fascinating to think about the use, the appropriation of classics as a sort of like subversion of the colonial role. Like I was wondering if you could expand a little bit more about the role of the audience and why the author, like what was, in your opinion at least, what was the final aim of creating this communication channel with other intellectuals, given also, yeah, the particular, like the smallness also like of the audience itself to a certain extent. Okay, thank you.
Shall we collect? Yeah, I think is.
Thank you so much for your wonderful talk. So Lascaro was written in 1927, but published first in 1950, right? Okay, so briefly after that, we know that Eritrea officially becomes a province of Ethiopia. So I was wondering about the reception of the book, if there was also some kind of Eritrean national pride around that, maybe is another step of the life of the book, maybe. I don't know, I'm just curious about it. Thank you so much.
Yes, correct.
No, thanks for your talk. I have a question about the relationship between oral tradition and popular culture and the novel. So if you can say if there is a connection, and what is the social position of these authors, and also what is the social composition of the audience?
Yeah, I think for we have plenty of issues on the table. Somehow the first two questions are related because they both deal with somehow the issue audience, if I understood it correctly. So the first one is about what was the final aim, if you want, of this book and of this author when addressing this audience. And the second one was about the reception of the book on the Light of Nations. Now the two things are related, the two questions, because something which I forgot to mention, which was very important, is that in the introductions, he says, I wrote this book in 1927. I've not been able to publish until today because of lack of means. And nowadays I can publish it thanks to the generous support of the Association for the Love of the Country. Now, for those who are familiar with Ethiopian Eritrean history, this name is a very important name because it was the name of an association of Eritrean and Ethiopian intellectuals, entrepreneurs, politicians who fought for the unification of Eritrea with Ethiopia. And that's why I say the two questions are related. Now I go to the first one. The political aim. The author is was from Eritrea. And as many Eritreans, particularly educated Eritreans in those years, consider himself proudly as an Ethiopian. So say, Eritrea doesn't exist by itself. Eritrea exists as part of Ethiopia, and I'm Ethiopian. So, of course, I couldn't go through the books, but if you will have the chance, he used generally when he referred to his own people, he used the term Habesha, which I maintain in the I didn't translate it. In Italian would be Abyssini probably, but if you say Abyssini is something which brings back the fascist. Habesha is a way we define ourselves. It is a way of saying people from Eritrea with Ethiopia from the highlands. So it is like us as opposed to the other people from the lowlands, which are different from us. They are mainly Muslim, we are Christians, they are nomadic. So there is a cultural marker, also kind of exclusive marker. Okay, so he used this term, but sometimes, occasionally, he shifts and he says, "We Ethiopians." Okay, so if you ask me, the final project was to raise the awareness of his own people against the colonial oppression, but also to persuade them that the only possible dream was with Ethiopia. Now, you have to put it, I am a historian, so I try to avoid the passion of politics. So I try to put myself in the shoes of those people. So you are a young intellectual in 1930 from Eritrea. You don't have any future in Eritrea because you can be educated however you want. You will not have the possibility to climb, I don't know, in the civil service. The maximum you can do will be to be a sort of secretary or interpreter of the Italian officer. The private sector is not so expanded, and it is mainly under the Italian control. Now you just cross the border and you have an emperor who say, "You are my brother. What are you doing there? Come here." I just found letters where the emperor was inviting educated people, saying, "Why do you waste your skills under those white oppressors? Come to us and we will build an independent African nation." So the message is obvious. So he's trying to raise awareness against Italian colonialism by saying, let's claim, exactly because we have such a rich tradition, which we all share, these classics also, let's contribute to build this independent African nation, which is Ethiopia. So this is fine. Now, this goes back to your question. He was a unionist. I think I talked to people who were familiar with him. He died in 93, so 2 months after the referendum when Eritrea became officially independent. And apparently some priest, which I've talked to, they said, well, he started slightly changing by saying, oh, those kids are not so bad at the end of the day. So he started thinking that maybe Eritrea could exist as an independent nation. Now, about the reception, when it was published, it was exactly, as you said, this transition from the colonial, Italian colonial administration. There was this transition which was called the British military administration because the British were kind of caretaker according to international law. And in those years, there was a very heated debate of what was going to happen. So is it going to be independent or under Ethiopia or whatever? So in this context, of course, this kind of novel had a huge political meaning and impact, of course, on one section, so the one which was sponsoring its book. Have I answered your question, both of them? Okay. The third one is about something which I completely skipped in my presentation, but is in the introduction to the text. So the relation with the oral tradition and popular culture. It is a very rich interaction, because okay, methodological issue. I said Ethiopia has this very rich tradition, which I define can be considered sort of classics. It is a written tradition which go back to the 2nd century and so on and so forth. But I forgot to say the most important thing. This does not mean that it is a society where there is no oral culture. On the opposite, you have a written tradition which has been, until very recent time, mainly the domain of the dominant class, of the elite, of the religious and political authorities. But the rest of the society very deeply immersed in the oral tradition and the so-called popular culture, however we want to define this term. Now, when I say the author swim easily in all different cultural worlds, I was referring also to this. So in his book, you have, as I said, quotation from, as I said, Leopardi. And that is fascinating because he used the poem Canzone all'Italia, which is a claim for, you know, for national unity against the oppressor. He used this poem to somehow, how can you say, to scold the Eritreans which go and die for a foreigner, not for themselves. At least if you were dying for your own nation, for your own land, that would make sense. But what is the sense in dying for a foreigner with whom you don't share anything, not even the religion, the culture, the language, okay? So he used this kind of quotation, or quotation from the Bible, so from the, let's say, the classic tradition. But then, for instance, when he wants to explain why this young boy decide to abandon a relatively good life to fight for the Italian, he used the songs, the popular songs which were sung in those days. If you don't go to Tripoli, it says in Tigrinya, much better in Tigrinya, of course, but if you don't go to Tripoli, you are a woman, which of course, in this sense, means you are not a real man. There is, of course, a kind of different understanding of gender relation. So the idea that going to serve under the Italian army was an expression of masculinity, and popular songs express this. Or he brings back also the impact. He tried to explain the impact of the warfare on the society. So the fact that there are no men anymore because all the youth disappeared. So he brings back popular songs which women used to sing in those days, symbolically calling for the priest, the Orthodox priest, and say, why don't you do anything? There are more or less no youngster left. They all went to Tripoli, and you don't do anything. Like you don't use your religious authority to bring them back or to stop them from leaving. Again, this is popular culture because those were the songs which were sung in those years. Or again, proverbs. Every chapter has at least three, four proverbs which he used when he wants to make clear a very important concept for him. Then, in order to be sure that everybody understands, he doesn't mention, Leopardi or a Greek philosopher. He mentioned a proverb which everybody understands and immediately get the point he's trying to bring. So, oral tradition, popular culture are always very much at the root of this text.
I have a question in the room. Yes, I'm coming.
Thank you so much for that. Yeah, just I mean, it's the book is probably written too soon for there to be a great deal of reflection on fascism. And fascism, from what you're saying, seems to emerge indirectly from the book as something of a continuation of a very entrenched colonial system, which of course is a powerful interpretation of itself of fascism. So I wonder if you could comment on that point. And I just have another sort of question, and that is quite differently, thinking about some of the ways in which the conflicts of the Italian empire were expressed and have been written about by writers like Masa Mengiste, and how one might go about a comparison between what is written now and the way in which writers attempt to write about the horror of the warfare itself, as well as, of course, the conceptual horror that underscores it, whether that's an avenue that you've looked at or not.
Thank you very much, Charles. This has been a great opportunity for me because we haven't met for 15, 18 years, and all of a sudden I find him here. So it was a big pleasure. So both questions are very complex and important. Yeah, as you said, at least if we buy the story which the author offered us, the text was written much earlier. So he had, well, already fascism was there, but was just, moving his first steps. I'm not so sure if it is so, in the sense that he says, I wrote in 1927, I published it in 1950. Now, I never published a novel, but I guess I would be tempted if I have a novel, I would revise it, adjust it. So we have to go with what he says, but taking into account that it's probably not completely true. In my understanding, from the perspective of Abba Ghebreyesus Hailu, of course, fascism, in his experience, has been probably something very, very bad and very negative. But I think he had already a perception of colonialism, of Italian colonialism, which was shaped by what he has experienced in Eritrea, by the discrimination within the Catholic Church when he was a student at the Collegio Ethiopico. All this fight, which I mentioned earlier on the liturgy, for us now, it may sound a very kind of abstract thing, but in those years was a very political issue. It was about, nowadays we say it was about race, it was about identity, it was about consciousness and so on and so forth. So it was a very political attitude. And it is interesting because I think, if you want, it is a paradox, because the church, even during the fascist time, provided a sort of not protected, but relatively protected area, because those people could travel, could have official roles even during fascism, because they were under the umbrella of the church. So it is a kind of paradox, if you want. So also, one thing which I would like to bring to the attention of the audience is that I didn't mention, for instance, the debate on periodization. Okay, normally we say World War II is from 1939 to 1945 or whatever. But then it is a question of perception. Eritrea started fighting, Eritrea and Ethiopia started fighting in 1912, basically in Libya, and they went all the way to 41, 42, 43 in Libya. So the experience of World War II, it is significantly different in the sense that it started much earlier, and the violence of the conflict, the death, the experience of the military exploitation, if you want, is something which predated the outbreak of World War II. I'm saying that because from the point of view of a colonial subject, I'm not so sure the difference between the liberal period and the fascist period was so strong. There were some legal issues, of course. You couldn't legally live in a white district, during the fascist period, you could be prosecuted for this. But during the liberal period, it was not accepted. It was not punished, but it was taken for granted that a Black person could not live in the district reserved to the Europeans. Then you are not going into jail. That is a difference. But the kind of segregation, the kind of separation was already there. So I'm not so sure if would have made such a difference for him. The difference for him, of course, would have been the fact that the Italians invaded also Ethiopia, which was the hope for a different future for Africa without the experience of colonialism. So this, of course, would have been the real difference. But I'm not so sure from the other point of view, the perception of the colonial rule would have been so different. But that's a very personal reading. Okay, if you want to compare the two, the different traditions, so Abba Jesus or Maza Mengistu or the others. Well, Maza Mengistu wrote the introduction to the novel, so we linked symbolically the two generations. Well, I think the difference, if I have to be maybe brutal, is that the cultural connection. Abba Ghebreyesus had a very strong and very clear connection with his culture, his tradition, his language. So for him, Ge'ez or Amharic or Tigray or Tigrinya, he could easily move and he could go and use proverbs, popular songs, whatever. The generation who right now, like Maza Mengistu or others, have a very impressive skills in terms of writing, but their again, that is my understanding, reading their books, their perception, their roots are, how can I say, they are filtered by the intellectual experience. You know, I don't know if I'm making myself clear. So they start from what could be also my experience. So as a historian, I study Italian colonialism in Eritrea, and then I understand what is Italian colonialism also from an Eritrean perspective. I haven't lived it. I was not born, and it has not been part of my experience. For them, it's similar from the point of view of the cultural exposure. The majority of them, Meaz, I think she was either born or grew up in the US. So for her, it's a kind of reclaiming something. It's not having lived something. I don't know if I'm making myself clear. So this is the difference between the two generations, I would say.
Yeah, okay.
Sorry, just for instance, those authors made a very extensive use of archives, which is very, because it's one of the few ways they have to understand what has been colonialism, to understand the complexity of this phenomenon. So they do an impressive work of documentation just to write a novel. It's not just fiction, but they have to go through the archives because there is no the first-hand connection. Sorry.
No. Thank you for your brilliant lecture. It's really very, very impressive. And a question about the modern day acceptance or reception of the book in Eritrea.
That's another complex question because I'm not aware of any available edition of this book in Eritrea. So it circulates either through elderly people who have an original copy and then they give you a photocopy. That is how I got to know it some 25 years ago through a Catholic priest who thought, but do you know this guy? It would be very useful for your research. So sorry, don't know him. So he gave me this copy and I still have this photocopy, which I have also scanned to be sure not to lose it. And But my understanding is, apart from very few, of course, educated people, but a small elite who knows the author, is not an author which is part of the, not the popular culture, but it is widely known in the Eritrean or Ethiopian cultural milieu. And I think this is for two reasons. In Eritrea, probably the fact that he chose the wrong side, because Eritrea became independent. So for the whole generation which somehow supported independence, you could have been the best intellectual, but if you were on the other side, we ignore you, which is sad, but it happens. It's part of politics. I would say it has been much more appreciated in Ethiopia, exactly for the same reason, because it is an evidence. You see, he's an Eritrean intellectual and he supported us. That's the evidence that the educated people make the right choice. So it is a kind of, I don't know if it has really been appreciated for his, for the value, the literary value of his writing, or because of the political exploitation which was possible. Nowadays, I think it is time probably to have it circulated and published, but I'm not aware of any project in this direction because I don't know, it's a complex set of reasons.
Maybe two small questions. One about what you said about the Collegio Etiopico. I'm imagining this Ethiopian Eritrean priest walking in Rome, seeing the city. I don't know. Can you say a bit more about their presence in the city? How they were connected with other people to probably outside the Vatican, outside the religious community. And the second point was about the colonial textbooks. You show us one of them, and you mentioned the emphasis on the achievement of ancient Rome in these books. Could you say a bit more about this, the production of these books, and where we can find them, and what we can learn from them about the vision, about the antiquity?
The first question is something which I'm still researching, so I don't have any final evidence. The Collegio Etiopico, as I said, was it has a very long and prestigious history. It goes back to the 15th century, and the idea was you had this flow of many of pilgrims which used to go to Jerusalem. Jerusalem has been, for obvious reason, the privileged target of migration for the Ethiopian, what is nowadays Ethiopian and Eritrean Orthodox Church. And there is an Ethiopian Orthodox church and hostel in Jerusalem, still nowadays. And some of them from Jerusalem, sometimes just by accident, because they got in touch with other priests or pilgrims coming from Rome, says, okay, let's go and have a seat. So that is basically how it started, this connection. But then it became something of more regular. So you had also, we would say nowadays, kind of ambassadors, so people who connected the two worlds, the two polities. It has been only in the 20th century that it has been transformed into a center of religious training. Originally, it was mainly a kind of hostel where linguistic studies were done, was the first font of the Greek alphabet for printing press were produced. Only in the 20th century, the Catholic hierarchy decided to transform it into a center for religious training. So you have a significant increase in terms of people coming predominantly from Eritrea, and in a smaller part from Ethiopia. Though, of course, the name remained Collegio Etiopico because that's how the region was identified. As I said, I'm still researching the issue, so I'm not sure if I can say something reasonable on the interaction with the territory, so Rome and whatever. But they were a very very cohesive, very strong community. And also you have to remember one important aspect: they all, at least for what I found until now, they all complain the fact that they survive. So the regional hierarchy don't give them adequate food, clothing, medical treatments and whatever. So I think also this material aspect has to be taken into account. But as I said, they were also very, very lively, very intense, and very aware community. So they were not just religious authority. And as I said, many of them will play a very important role as Abba Gebreyesus Haylu, also in the politics of his time. Sorry, I haven't much more to add, to say on this. On the colonial textbook, yeah, there is one thing which I skipped in my presentation. As I say that the colonial educational policy were very restrictive in the sense they didn't allow training until access to education until grade 4. But I didn't say two things. One is that under fascism, if you want, is a paradox. This access to education was slightly enlarged, so the equivalent of what is grade 7 nowadays, plus other kind of technical trainings. But the most important thing is that education in the Italian colonial system, as in many other colonial systems, was left to the missionary authorities. So missionaries were assigned this task for obvious reasons. Missionaries were there before the colonial administration, knew the language, had already the networks, and they were present on the whole territory. So it was a very rational choice. Even France, which has a very secular tradition in the colonies, accepted this model. So the textbook are all textbook, those which I mentioned, produced by the missions. And they are textbook of language, history, geography, math, and normally they are bilingual. So they have the Italian text and the text in Tigrinya or in Arabic. The idea was Christians, students will have to use the Tigrinya Italian version, Muslims, the Arabic Italian version. They are all available here. I think Biblioteca Nazionale, you can find copies, and of course in the archives of the different Vatican archives, you have copies of them. And what is very interesting is that I found in the archives of Farnesina not just the textbook, but rather the exams which those students were taking. So you see how can I say, the output of those textbooks, which is a fascinating material.
Yes, Suzanne.
Yes, thank you very much. I wanted to ask you about the relationship between maybe translation, the audience, and the subversive nature of this book, because I was wondering whether you think the author had already imagined translation, for example, in Italian or other European languages, because I think he's so typical, let's say, sort of a bridge figure between two cultures of classics, and he would also be the ideal person to sort of to bridge these two cultures. And I think, as you say, that he navigated so easily between the two, well, types of traditions. And I think also to be read as in subverting sort of the traditional travel narratives, sort of this civilizing mission, you would imagine that the audience would also be, let's say, aware of this canon. So I was wondering to what extent the audience would have read his version of the travel indeed as subverting, let's say, classical travel narratives of imperial nature. For example, the Aeneid would certainly have been taught, but I'm not sure whether it would have been part of either the colonial education. So that was also the connection with Maria's question: to what extent would this education have also included these sort of the classical narratives? And on the other hand, maybe whether he would have imagined the translation also. What do you know of, or you can imagine from what you know about him?
Yeah, that's another very complex, a very deep question. If I understood correctly, the idea, or if he had taken into account the idea of a translation in Italian or any other language, I'm not so sure, in the sense that this book, the way I understand it, but also based on what he wrote in his introduction, but also in other small articles, it was a kind of exclusive address. So he, my understanding is that he aimed at his own audience. So I don't think he was so much interested, or if he planned any translation, but that's just speculating, because he's not with us anymore, and he's the only one who could have answered this question. He has written extensively, for instance, he has written a small pamphlet in Amharic where he, for instance, he celebrates the importance of spreading the knowledge and the study of goods, and say that is our wealth, but also the need to strengthen Amharic, to make Amharic a language which is not just, for public, consumption, for public speaking, but also language of culture, language of education. So my idea is that he was very much focused on the project of raising local awareness on the culture, the wealth of cultural tradition. So I don't know how much he would have been interested in the idea of a translation. The idea of the classics as a I mean, of the subversion of the literary canon, and so the subversive nature of his writing, that is how I read it. I think for the audience, the subversion was, I don't know how to explain it, implicit. It was subversive, the fact by itself. You have an African voice who says, well, this war was a terrible experience of pain, of discrimination, of oppression, and he constantly repeat in different terms the quotation from Leopardi, by saying there is no sense in fighting and dying for a country which is not your country, for a government which is not your government. This is just silly, this is just meaningless. So this is the subversion. Then he used those tools, and it is implicitly subversive. But I'm not going to say that also the audience perceives the subversion. It would have been maybe reading too much, but I think that is how I would put it.
I don't know if there are any questions. Also online.
Line are slowly fading away.
So maybe it's a time to thanks again Professor Chelati Dirar for his wonderful lecture.
Thank you.
And I would like to invite all of you to have a drink together, and we can discuss further all our questions and remarks with Professor Chelati Dirar. And arrivederci for next time. For the people online, of course. Thank you.